Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. It's me, Jeff Black, your host, your homie, joined by my bro, Brandon DeCruz. Today, we have episode 111, The Science of Stubborn Body Fat, How to Lose Stubborn Fat Through Diet, Exercise, and Strategic Supplementation. Full disclosure, Brandon just blew my mind and told me he's going to briefly discuss topics he never has, i.e., drugs and other things. So if you really want to hear his honest damn opinion, because you never hear it, I only know it because I've had many late nights with him, which late night is up staying up till 8 p.m. But of conversations. So it's rare that you hear this. So you definitely want to tune this episode. But that being said, a lot of people reached out to me about my dog. Look, here's the deal. I came down that morning. He was on his bed. I looked at him, was like, "Good morning, Dorian." And he was like, yawned at me. He turned around and went back to sleep. All right. This is where I made a fatal mistake. I shut the light off. So in my house, there's a corridor that takes you from the garage into like the hallway where there's like a closet, a pantry, a bathroom, and it takes me into your kitchen. It takes you into my kitchen. I shut the light off. This is important. I wear a black big hoodie. I wear black pants, and I always put the hoodie over my head with a beanie to sweat. I like to sweat during cardio. Brandon does a similar thing. I noticed when I was stretching that there were red lights in the street, like someone was like casing the neighborhood lately. Different individuals from the metropolitan Nashville area, aka Blue City, have been traveling into the red counties and fucking around and finding out. And so I was like, oh great, someone's just probably trying to break into cars. And at this point, I go in to the house. What I do not know is that my dog is on the other side of that door barking because I am listening to heavy metal. August Burns Red, 200 beats per minute, melting my face off. Upon opening the door, I hit him. He jumped up and bit my lip, at which point I got very lucky and threw my fist and managed to catch him because he had latched on. And I managed to get him to break that latch, which tore through my lip. So he was pulling me forward. So when I punched him, that's why it ripped. Okay. He was pulling me forward to take me to the ground to shake me because he didn't know who I was. You got to think it's dark, dogs see black and white, and I'm on the other side of that door. And he had alerted me. And any other time he barks, I'm usually like, shut up, like an old cranky man. You know what I mean? So that's the long and short of it. The lip folded over. It was a horrible situation between both of us. And no, I did not put my dog down because he did his job. And yeah, so that's that. I wanted to clue everybody in because a lot of people had asked me. I really appreciate the heartfelt wishes. I got away with a minor scar. The only funny story I'm going to tell you, Brandon, is that doctor when I walked in, he goes, "Let me see it." I dropped it. My lip folded all halfway over. Okay, because he severed me like right up near my like where your mouth like connects. And he goes, whoa, you need to go to Vanderbilt. You need to be underneath general anesthetic. Oh my God, you need a plastic surgeon. I'm like, bro, man, like it's 5:15 in the morning. Like it's gonna be like 10 before they see that. And I knew I had adrenaline pumping, my BP's through the roof, my heart rate's through the roof. I said, let's just do it. And this old lady who's a nurse chimes in and goes, doctor, you did sew that guy's ear on a couple months ago. And I said, dude, you sewed a guy's ear back on? I said, oh, you my guy. And so he starts like typing himself into it. I'm like, yeah, you got this, man. You got this. Let's get some coffee. Let's do this. So I proceed to get 20 direct shots to every open wound of mine, along with a tetanus shot to get this done. But within an hour, I was stitched up and ready to go. And back home, back on my couch by 7 o'clock, relaxing. I had a little bit of a concussion, I realized, because Sunday I started actually thinking clear. It was just a situation, man. And, that's one of those things that just reminds me of, I look at it like this, man. Had I been 2 inches taller, that could have been my throat. Had it been, all sorts of different scenarios. But at the end of the day, it taught me a lot of stuff with the dog. And the best part is someone saw that, who was a dog trainer, and offered to reach out and work with me with Dorian to help with some commands to the door. So, there's always a silver lining in every situation if you look at it. So that being said, that is the dog incident. That is how it is. Dorian is sitting outside my door looking at me. The dog will not leave me alone. I can tell he feels awful. So that is that. And if that offends you, don't tell me. But with that being said, let's get on to the topic. So this one was a hot topic. It was one of our best podcasts, according to you all, liking it, sharing it, and most importantly, listening to it. So Brandon went back and he listened to the two podcasts, kind of created some ideas for a new one. We could kind of talk a little bit more, a little bit deeper, I guess, on the topic of stubborn body fat. Everybody asks about that. Everybody who's dieted gets that point where eventually they get a case of the fuckets and they give up and they go the other way. So we thought we would talk about how to lose stubborn fat through diet, exercise, and strategic supplementation. So we're going to get into what stubborn body fat is. And most everybody's just like, that last little bit that no matter won't go. And for me, it's my back. My back is always the last little bit. It's
Same
usually
here.
my upper back, which is weird. My low back will kind of come in before my upper back, but it just lets you know you got it anywhere. So Brandon, let's go into this. Let's talk about stubborn body fat and give people kind of the breakdown on it.
Absolutely. So, like you mentioned, this was one of our hot topics when we first started the podcast. So now we have a different audience, a different listenership. We have many more people that have come to it. And then also just my thoughts, my approaches, my strategies have changed over the years. And so that's why you kind of mentioned in the intro that we're going to talk about some pharmacology and stuff. And these are topics I tread lightly on. And it's not that I don't know about them. You and I have had private conversations many a times about these topics, but I'm very cognizant of the fact that I do reach a lot of people and I always want to lead you guys in the right direction. And a lot of times when it comes to certain topics, especially pharmacology, I want you to make your own informed decisions. And I don't want to be like everyone else on the internet that puts out content just to reel you in, but really they don't know, they don't have expertise on these areas. And oftentimes they can mislead you into making decisions that may not be right for you, both from an ethical standpoint and then also from a health related standpoint. So I am going to touch on some topics that I am familiar with. I'm going to cover the mechanisms of action, things of that sort. But really, first and foremost, we're going to get a high level overview of stubborn body fat. And so this week, I wanted to cover the science of stubborn body fat, as losing body fat is a common goal that so many of you out there have and wish to achieve. And the process of losing fat is something that sounds simple on paper, which is why there are so many fitness professionals and influencers out there who are constantly just yelling calorie effing deficit, which is one of the things that I see so commonly, and it just irritates me. It gets on my nerves because although that statement in and of itself is, true, it isn't useful. So it's, saying that to someone, saying that you just need a calorie effing deficit is not going to solve our current obesity epidemic and help everyone who wishes to drop body fat to do so quick and easily. And I'm not here to dispute the fact that a calorie deficit is needed to lose body fat, as the law of thermodynamics is a law of physics. So it does come down to calories in and calories out from a mathematical perspective. But here's the thing, I'm not an influencer, nor is my primary role as a content creator. I'm first and foremost a coach who works with clients in the real world. And I'm constantly talking to others about losing fat. And a lot of you out there are just confused by the process. You're frustrated by your lack of results, and you don't know who or exactly what to listen to. So when we first started this podcast, the goal was to help others look better, feel better, and function better by providing clarity on complex topics. And one of the most confusing and complex topics is fat loss, and especially stubborn fat loss. And that's why so many struggle to effectively and efficiently drop body fat. So on today's show, we're going to cover the topic of stubborn body fat, as this is a situation and an obstacle so many of us encounter in our pursuit of achieving and improving our physiques. And so stubborn body fat refers to the areas which are harder to mobilize and lose fat from. The areas and regions of our body where we store and hold stubborn fat in will differ from person to person. Just like Jeff mentioned, it's his upper back, but actually for me, it's my lower back. And so the fact of the matter is, some fat cells in our bodies are more stubborn, meaning they're more resistant to mobilizing and liberating stored fat from. And this is one reason as to why many of us have noticed that certain areas on our body are both easier to store fat in, yet at the same time, it's like the worst of both worlds. They're not only easier to store body fat in, but also they're harder to lose body fat from. And I'll tell you personally that I tend to struggle losing fat from my lower back region. My low back tends to be the last place I lose fat in during a fat loss phase. And the only times you wouldn't notice that I hold fat in this area is when I've been in stage condition, when I used to compete in bodybuilding. But that meant that I had to get down to close to essential levels of body fat just to lose these stubborn fat areas. So stubborn body fat isn't just a topic I've studied and I've encountered with many clients over the years, but it's also something I have personal experience with. And honestly, I'll be completely frank and transparent with you guys. One of the reasons I don't post, pictures of my back, especially when I'm not in a fat loss phase, is because I'm self-conscious about it. And so the goal of today's podcast is to explain why some regions are more stubborn than others, the differences in fat storage patterns between women and men, because I work with clients of both sexes, and we have just differential fat storage patterns and differences in how we store and liberate body fat. So I do want to go over that so that everyone out there can benefit from this podcast. And then we're going to talk about how to go about putting yourself in the best position to succeed with the goal of losing stubborn body fat.
All right, let's get into this. So, why are some areas more difficult to lose fat from than others? Now, I have a question, B. Are we going to take this in the direction of like talking about dieting history? Like how many times I tell people you take a swipe at it and get successful swipes. Like I didn't have a striated lower back until my fifth show. You know what I mean? Like it took multiple attempts for me to get that. And I was always curious, like why were some areas more difficult to lose than others? So with that being said, how do you want to unfold that in the direction? Let's roll.
Absolutely. So I'll go into it. Overall, I'm sure many of you have noticed that you have certain areas of your body where you tend to hold more fat in than others. And these also tend to be the same areas that you struggle to lose fat from as easily during a fat loss phase. So as Jeff, you were just alluding to, you notice that during your initial preps, often during the initial preps or the initial fat loss phase that we go to, we don't get as lean as we ultimately get once we have more experience, once we are more adapted to the process, we are more efficient and proficient at the process of inducing a calorie deficit, maintaining that deficit, and then also executing on the habits and behaviors that are needed to lose body fat. So yes, like you mentioned, it wasn't until your fifth prep that you really got to that level where you lost that stubborn body fat, but that's also because throughout that process, you got leaner. And there's multiple reasons as to why some areas contain more stubborn fat than others. And so, first and foremost, we generally get lean from the inside out and the top down, which is why you'll usually notice that when you or someone else that you know is in a fat loss phase and they're dieting, their face, their arms, and usually their delts get lean before the rest of their body does, including their lower back, their lower abs, and their legs. So we notice that there's almost like a discrepancy. It goes in stages. So you'll notice that some areas, especially our extremities, so like our arms and our deltoids, will get lean first, and then it's often like the rest of our body's lagging behind. And so the reason for this is because stubborn body fat isn't tapped into until we get fairly deep into a diet. We've maintained a calorie deficit for a consistent period of time and have lost a significant amount of body fat already. And this is really why many individuals feel like they can't lose their stubborn body fat, especially around like their belly and their thighs, as they haven't lost in the past. And if you're someone who can relate to that experience, it's not that this stubborn fat is impossible for you to lose. It's just likely that you haven't dieted either long enough or you weren't consistent enough with maintaining an effective deficit to get lean enough to the point where you did start to burn fat from the areas in your body which you hold stubborn fat in. So regions like your lower back, your lower abs, your hips and thighs are areas that tend to have and store more stubborn fat in them, which make them challenging to lose fat from in comparison to other areas such as your arms and delts. And this is for two main reasons. So we're going to go through these. The first reason why some areas are more difficult to lose fat from is due to the type of adrenergic receptors fat cells in these areas contain. So in order to mobilize stored fat from our fat cells, our body releases catecholamines. So these are chemicals and hormones, and this includes things like epinephrine, which is also referred to as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, which is also referred to as noradrenaline. And these bind to adrenergic receptors on fat cells to release the stored fat in these cells to be burned off as energy. Now, there are two types of adrenergic receptors on fat cells, which catecholamines can bind to. We have alpha receptors, and we also have beta receptors. So alpha receptors are inhibitory receptors, meaning when they're activated by catecholamines, they blunt lipolysis and block our ability to mobilize fat out of our fat cells to be burned for energy. So in turn, these receptors have anti-fat loss actions. That's all you have to remember. Alpha receptor, anti-fat loss. Now, on the other hand, we have beta receptors, and these are stimulators or stimulatory receptors, meaning when they're activated by catecholamines, they increase lipolysis and they allow for fatty acids to be mobilized out of our fat cells so we can burn them as energy, as these receptors have pro-fat loss properties. So the ratio of beta receptors to alpha receptors in specific fat tissues is what determines how easily it is to mobilize fat from that area and burn it and ultimately lose fat from that area. So now one reason why some areas contain more stubborn fat than others is because those areas contain a greater density of those alpha receptors, meaning those anti-fat loss receptors. So they inhibit lipolysis and make these areas more resistant to fatty acid mobilization, meaning it's harder to get stored fat out of these areas so that we can burn them off, as energy. Whereas areas that are easier to lose fat from, generally have a higher amount of those beta receptors, which make mobilizing and losing fat from these areas far easier. This is why it isn't until you get deep into a diet and have already gotten quite lean that you start to lose fat from these stubborn areas, as you've already mobilized and lost the majority of fat in other areas of your body. So now your body essentially needs to tap into these stubborn areas to get energy out of, because it's running out of resources. So now it's almost like a survival mechanism where it's like, listen, I got this stubborn fat on your ass. I'm going to have to tap into that for energy. Now, the second reason why some areas are harder to lose fat from than others is due to having less blood flow in these areas. So, blood flow is important to the process of fat loss, as we can mobilize fatty acids out of a fat cell, but we need sufficient blood flow for these fatty acids to be transported from the fat cell that they come out of to somewhere like our muscles where they can be burned for energy. So, stubborn fat areas, containing areas like your lower abs, your low back, your hips and thighs, receive less blood flow than other areas in our body, like our arms and our calves, which make these areas harder to mobilize and burn fat from. And this should be pretty intuitive to many of you guys. If you notice, like your low back, your low abs, your hips, that like muffin top region, a lot of times those are cold to the touch. And then also, if you really think about it, if you look at it when you're lean, oftentimes those areas aren't well vascularized. So if you look at your arms and your delts, even when you're in off season, you're in a building phase and you're at, say, a bit higher body fat than you would be during a fat loss phase, you'll notice that these areas such as your arms, your delts, your calves are still vascular, especially things like your forearms. They still have great blood flow and nutrient supply. So it's easier to get a pump in these areas. It's easier to get blood flow in and out of these areas. Whereas like areas like your low back, your low abs, you'll notice that you're generally not vascular in these areas. You're not seeing veins really prominently in these areas until you get very, very lean. And they also get less blood flow. So it's a two-part mechanism. It's both the receptors in these areas, but then it's also the blood flow or lack of blood flow, which causes some areas to be more stubborn than others.
When you bring that up, I immediately thought of Matt Porter, Rip, and his supplement Vasoburn, because that was his theory
Mhm.
about the Yohimbe to kind of heat those stubborn areas up because of the thermal imaging showing they were cold. And I remember the first time, after I read that the next morning after cardio, I was in a prep and I got off and smacked my lower back. I'm like, no shit, this is cold as ice. And my
Mhm.
legs are hot, because I like have lean legs, lean ass, year round. And I'm always hot through there, like pissing myself. So good mental image, right, guys? But anyway, that was a great point you brought up. But did you ever use Vasoburn? Oh, we'll save it.
Absolutely. I have
Yeah,
used it
we'll save
many
it. We got a
times.
supplement. We can talk about that.
Yeah, no, so I've used it many times, but we can get into that later. I
Yeah,
won't
yeah,
go
yeah.
through Vasoburn in and of itself, but I'll go through the ingredients that were in there.
Yeah, cool. All right. So where are we at on this that you kind of want to go? Because it's kind of like a lot that we got on there. So why are the difference in body fat storage between patterns between men and women?
Yeah, so I want to go through like where we store body fat and why different sexes store differently. So I'll go
Okay,
through
cool.
that right now.
Okay, cool. That's
So
smart.
where we store body fat and how body fat is distributed is highly influenced by our genetics, but another major factor that influences where we store fat is our sex, as women and men have different fat storage and distribution patterns. So when we look at body fat distribution and storage patterns in women, females have what's referred to as a gynoid body fat distribution pattern, which means that they store more fat in their lower body, including their hips, their thighs, and their glutes. Due to how women store body fat, this distribution pattern is often referred to as a pear-shaped distribution pattern. The advantageous part about how women store fat is that they tend to store more subcutaneous fat in their hips and thighs, which a lot of times we look at sub-Q fat and that's a jiggly fat. And so a lot of times from a cosmetic perspective, women aren't happy that they store it. But if we look at it from another side, this actually allows women to maintain better metabolic health even at higher body fat percentages as compared to men. So women not only have higher essential body fat levels, but they also have higher amounts of subcutaneous body fat, but it actually leads them to have better metabolic health from an insulin sensitivity perspective, a cardiovascular disease risk perspective. So there's both give me's and gotchas essentially. So women also tend to have a greater density and amount of alpha receptors in these areas, which make them harder to mobilize fat out of. And these areas also receive less blood flow, as I mentioned previously. So, this is why many women out there will notice and will be able to relate to the fact that they struggle with stubborn fat in their areas like their hips and their thighs. Now, the hormonal patterns that influence a woman's body fat distribution pattern tend to protect women from experiencing as many metabolic diseases, including things like cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome as men until women reach menopause, when their distribution patterns change and we start seeing females store more fat centrally, meaning around their midsection, due to the decline in estrogen that occurs during menopause, which is why premenopausal and postmenopausal women will generally have different trouble areas that they'll be looking to lose. So this is something that I notice in practice. So for instance, I work with women of all different ages, and I have a wide range of ages on my coaching roster currently, but the majority of women that I work with right now are between the ages of 35 to 55 years old. So I often see that in females in their 30s and early 40s, they tend to store more fat in their hips and thighs. But women who come to me in their late 40s and 50s report noticing that they've been gaining more weight in their midsection and their core. And this is due to the menopausal transition and the changes and decreases in sex hormone production women experience during perimenopause. And then once they hit menopause, meaning they've went 12 months without a cycle, they have completely lost their cycle. What we see is that they start having shifts in their body fat distribution patterns. But I want to make this clear. Yes, it is hormonally mediated, but there's other factors. It's also tied into their training habits, their activity levels, their nutrition and lifestyle. As generally, if I start working with a client who's just getting into perimenopause or who starts perimenopause while we're working together, I honestly don't notice that they're gaining body fat in their midsection. And that's due to the fact that we have their diet, their training, their supplementation, and their activities locked in, which is why I don't believe it's just down to your hormones. But yes, hormones do play a factor, but your lifestyle does as well. Now, men on the other side, or on the other hand, store fat in an android fat distribution pattern, which is often referred to as an apple shape, because we typically store fat centrally around the trunk region, which includes our stomach and low back, whereas we store less fat in our arms and legs, especially towards our outer extremities, which includes like our arms, our forearms, and then our calves. Since men store fat more centrally around the gut and organs, we tend to gain more visceral fat as compared to women who gain more subcutaneous fat. So, if we are to gain an excessive amount of fat, this is why men have a higher association with higher rates of insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. Because when you gain visceral adiposity, those are that's more metabolically unhealthy fat. And this is why men are more predisposed to cardiovascular issues than women for most of our lives. Now, I'll always say this, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. So women tend to store more subcutaneous fat than men, which is more metabolically healthy fat to gain, but it's also harder to tap into and lose. Whereas men tend to gain more visceral fat, which is more deleterious to our health. But it's also easier fat to liberate and lose if you do things right from a nutrition, training, cardio, and activity perspective. So there are both advantages and disadvantages to how men and women store body fat and also how they lose body fat. But this is kind of like the underlying reasons as to why we see different issues in terms of stubborn fat between men and women.
I will say this, dude. It's usually just so much easier for a man to lose body fat than a woman. Like, it's almost just crazy to me. And you explained a lot of great reasons, but I want to get into something. What are the processes do we have to go through to lose body fat? And like, what do you mean by that? What are the processes to lose body fat?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people would assume that I'm just talking about a calorie deficit. And yes, a calorie deficit is needed. So a lot of people know that you need to create a calorie deficit to be able to lose body fat. But what a lot of people don't understand is the underlying physiology that governs how we actually burn fat for energy. So in order to burn body fat, we need to go through a three-step process, which includes first step is lipolysis, then transport, and then oxidation. So this first step to burning fat is lipolysis, as we need to break down fat first to burn it off as energy. So lipolysis is the process of taking the fat that's actually stored in your fat cell, which is stored as a triglyceride, and then breaking it down so that we can mobilize and liberate the three fatty acids from that triglyceride into the bloodstream to eventually be burned off as energy. And the main way to mobilize stored fat from our fat cells is through the release of catecholamines, specifically epinephrine and norepinephrine, aka adrenaline and noradrenaline. And the reason I want to go through this process and explain to you guys how this gets accomplished and the steps that goes through it is because when we go through the the three strategies to most effectively lose stubborn body fat, they're all going to center around maximizing this three-step process. So we need to understand, how does fat get burned first and foremost, to be able to know how do we target stubborn body fat. So when we look at lipolysis, it really centers around catecholamines. And catecholamines are hormones that are involved in increasing fuel mobilization, which is why they're so influential in the fat burning process. Because when catecholamines bind to the beta receptor, they increase lipolysis and allow for more fat to be broken down. So catecholamines are produced and released in response to activities like exercise, physical activity, supplementation, especially specific supplementation, which we'll cover later, and then also being in a calorie deficit. Now, the second step of the process is transport. And this is kind of where I go back to the importance of blood flow. So once we mobilize fatty acids from our fat tissue into our bloodstream, these fatty acids need to be transported to a cell, such as a muscle cell, where they can be burned off. And so fatty acid transport is dependent on the blood flow in that area, as sufficient blood flow is needed to transport the free fatty acids to the target tissue to be burned. Now, if there isn't sufficient blood flow in an area, fatty acids will be reesterified, which means they'll be restored back in a fat cell and go back to being stored fat. So essentially, you can liberate fat. You can go through the first step, which is a lipolysis. But if you're unable to transport those fatty acids into a muscle cell, into the mitochondria of a muscle cell to be burned off, they're just going to get restored. And we see that quite often. And so our ability to burn fat in different areas and regions of our body is heavily dependent on the blood flow in the regions. And so this is why many of us find that we have stubborn body fat on our low back and abs, our hips and thighs, as these are areas that have poor blood flow, which makes mobilizing and transporting fatty acids to be burned more difficult than other areas like our arms and calves. Now, the last step of the process is oxidation. So once fatty acids have been mobilized and transported to the muscle that they're going to be burned at, they will need to be transported into the mitochondria of that cell to be used for energy, which is the last step in this process. As once fat goes through beta oxidation, it's been burned off for energy. Now, this is the process of burning body fat, but in order to actually lose that fat from our body, we need to maintain a calorie deficit over a prolonged period of time, as burning fat is only one component of the fat loss equation. The other component is maintaining a calorie deficit so we can get into a state of negative fat balance. Because you can burn fat during an activity like exercise, whether that be cardio or resistance training. But if you're eating in a surplus after it, and you're eating a surplus the rest of your day, you're going to be restoring fat after that workout is done and over with. So you will have went through the fat burning process, but not the fat loss process. So this is really important to differentiate. This is also why there are certain dietary strategies, whether that be low carb or keto, and they say that it turns you into a fat burning machine. That's all well and good, yes. The predominant macronutrient that you eat in your diet will influence what you oxidize. So if you eat a high carb diet, you'll burn more carbohydrates as energy. If you eat a high fat diet, you'll burn more fat for energy. But if you're still in a surplus in both of those equations, you're not losing fat regardless of what dietary approach that you take.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. So then what are three strategies we can use to lose stubborn body fat? Strategy one, maintaining a consistent calorie deficit. Well done.
Mhm. So in order to lose body fat, we need to check a few boxes. We need to induce a consistent calorie deficit that's sustained long enough to lose a significant amount of body fat to be able to tap into our stubborn body fat areas, which it's really important to start with this one because a lot of people have struggled with stubborn body fat and they've never lost it. And often it's because they've never consistently maintained a deficit for long enough and lost enough body fat to actually see the true, I guess, fruits of their labor, and also to get to the level of leanness that would allow them to lose that stubborn body fat. But then, in addition to diet, we also need to stimulate a high degree of catecholamine production so that we can increase lipolysis. And so, the first strategy to losing stubborn fat needs to start with diet. That's going to be our foundation to this process. And you need to maintain a calorie deficit, as without a deficit, you're not going to be able to lose a significant amount of body fat, and you're certainly not going to lose those stubborn areas. So, body fat is lost in stages where you'll lose a visceral fat first, and then you'll start losing subcutaneous fat. But the subcutaneous fat you lose will first come from areas with a higher density of those beta receptors, which are those pro fat loss receptors. So, unless you stay in a deficit long enough and are consistently adherent to it, to lose enough total fat mass and reduce your body fat percentage enough, you won't get to the point where you'll be able to see losses in stubborn body fat spots. And this is why, if you look at men and women who get very lean and to lower body fat percentages, and that could be individuals like physique competitors, they could be athletes, like professional athletes or even amateur athletes, or fitness models, you'll rarely notice any stubborn body fat on them. But that's because they've gotten lean enough to the point where they're holding little fat in general. And due to how consistent and diligent these types of individuals are with their diet, their training, and their supplementation, they're far less, or you're far less likely to hear them talk about having issues dropping stubborn body fat as compared to someone in the general population who tries to diet on and off, but never stays consistent enough for long enough to get lean enough. So the first step to burning body fat, especially stubborn body fat, requires us to dial in our nutrition and more specifically maintain a calorie deficit long enough to give ourselves the opportunity to lose these stubborn fat areas.
Okay, so now let's get into exercise. This is one where 2 days, 3 days, I've heard it all. What do we mean by exercise at this point when you're trying to get rid of stubborn body fat?
Absolutely. So this is going to be more multifactorial. So we got the first step, that's maintaining a calorie deficit. But beyond that, there are some other strategies to losing stubborn body fat. And I'm going to come to this from a practical perspective, especially from like an experience perspective, because I've used many strategies over the years, with clients to help them mobilize stored fat so that they could lose fat at a more efficient and a more effective rate. And also so that we can get them to tap into some of their stubborn body fat areas and to be able to liberate and mobilize and burn fat from these stubborn body fat spots. So this second strategy is going to be exercise. And that sounds very generic, but really when it comes to exercise not only increases energy expenditure, aka the amount of calories you burn per day, which can allow you to create and sustain a greater deficit, but it also has a multi-pronged action. So it actually helps to increase our production of catecholamines, including noradrenaline and adrenaline, which help with the fat mobilization process from our fat cells. So exercising actually kicks off that first step of the process, which is lipolysis. So the first step of the fat burning process. Now, the higher intensity the exercise, the more catecholamines are released, which is why it's beneficial to engage in multiple forms of exercise and to use a combination of resistance training and cardio during a fat loss phase. And so this isn't going to be a debate between should you only do resistance training, should you only do cardio? They both have their roles. So higher intensity forms of exercise like resistance training help to mobilize fatty acids from the fat cell itself. But fatty acid oxidation or the burning of these liberated fatty acids is best achieved with lower intensity exercise like steady state cardio because our muscles preferably and preferentially use fat for fuel when we perform lower intensity aerobic training, whereas our muscles will switch over and use mostly glucose during higher intensity anaerobic activities like resistance training. So resistance training is by far the best method to transform your body from a muscle mass perspective. But when it comes to burning fat and expending more calories, cardio takes the cake on a head-to-head comparison, which is why it's important to include both into your program if your goal is to maximize your body composition by both building muscle and losing fat. Now, aerobic training is also more effective for reducing visceral fat than resistance training is. And this was shown in a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at 35 studies, which found that aerobic training, aka cardio, led to greater reductions in visceral fat than resistance training. So this is why I like to include cardio into my fat loss phases. And although cardio can be done at any time as long as you do the right duration, I do think there are some theoretical and then also real world benefits of doing it in a fasted state. And this is something I've seen in practice. So this is because doing low intensity aerobic work fasted, like steady state cardio in the morning on a fasted stomach, preferentially burns fat for energy since it relies on aerobic metabolism, meaning it uses fat for fuel. And also when you do it fasted, you're in a low insulin environment where blood glucose levels are low, insulin levels are low. So fat is the preferential fuel source being used. So when you do cardio in a fasted state where your insulin is low, your body is better able to mobilize and burn fat than when insulin levels are higher, such as eating and being in a postprandial state. So meaning if you are to eat and then do cardio, essentially what ends up happening is when you eat a meal, you increase insulin production. And then that ends up switching over your preferential fuel source to run off glucose, which blunts lipolysis. So you lose or you use less stored fat for energy and you use more of the carbohydrates you've eaten for energy during that cardio session. Also, if you're using certain fat burning compounds and have certain lipolytic agents in place, such as caffeine, yohimbine, L-carnitine, and potentially growth hormone, these all help to increase the mobilization of fatty acids when we're in a fasted state, which allows us to oxidize and burn more fat during these processes if we follow up taking these fat burning agents and these compounds by doing fasted cardio or aerobic work. So if you're someone who is using specific supplements or enhancements prior to doing your fasted cardio, such as the few we will cover in the next section, which help with liberating more fatty acids to be utilized as fuel in a fasted state, fasted cardio may provide you with an additional benefit over fed cardio, as the presence of insulin will suppress some of the benefits of these compounds if you take them and then you eat and then you decide to do cardio. So this is where kind of more of the nuances of specific exercise timing, nutrient timing in terms of supplementation timing come into play. Whereas a lot of times in the research, when we look at head-to-head comparisons of fasted versus fed cardio, it's in natural individuals that have high body fat levels. They're not getting that lean. It's over very short time durations, and there's not as many of these levers being pulled and looked at because research looks at different principles or different adjustments in isolation to just isolate one variable. So is fasted cardio better than fed cardio? In fasted cardio versus fed cardio trials, they're really looking at energy expenditure, and they're matching the amount of calories each group burns. So over a course of 24 hours, they burn the same or they lose the same amount of body fat. But when you throw in some of these other vectors and you pull up the levers on not only fasted cardio, but strategic supplementation and all these different things, that's where we can see an advantageous benefit from doing things in a more strategic manner.
All right, let's get into the topic of specific supplementation, the drugs, baby. Let's talk about it. Now, there's a lot of different ones out there. Full disclosure, I don't think Brandon's going to talk about DMP. That one will probably
Absolutely not.
completely skip on, and rightfully so. If you can't, I don't know. I have my thoughts on that. I'll just stay silent. But anyway, let's get into the specific supplementation that we like and that we've utilized and we played around with in the trenches. And I'll pepper in my thoughts along the way because I've been a little bit more enhanced and work with a lot of enhanced guys. So I'll pepper in along the way. So let's get it, B.
My friend. So the last strategy for losing stubborn body fat is the use of specific supplementation. So as Jeff alluded to, there are many that we could cover. And honestly, for the sake of the timing of this podcast, for both of us, in terms of how much time we have to devote to this, and then also I really wanted to make more of a comprehensive list. So I'm going to cover 6 compounds today, including yohimbine, ephedrine, growth hormone, clenbuterol, L-carnitine, and caffeine. However, I'm just going to go over how they work and their benefits in terms of the fat loss that they help, because I spent honestly 10 years in the supplement industry or in the sports nutrition industry. And then I've also spent the last 11 years coaching. And I've seen so many inter-individual differences in people's response to these compounds that it would be a disservice and it would be misleading and it wouldn't be something that I would feel ethically right with to give a blanketed dose or prescription to any of you out there that may or may not work for those of you out there. And so I'm going to go through the mechanisms. I'm going to go through some of their effects, some of their benefits, and then you guys can just take that information and do with it what you will. And so first and foremost, we're going to cover yohimbine. So when it comes to losing stubborn body fat, one of the most effective supplements that I've used both with myself and with many clients during fat loss phases is yohimbine. And I'm specifically referring to yohimbine hydrochloride. Now, yohimbine hydrochloride is an alpha-2 antagonist that increases catecholamine production. Yohimbine is effective for helping you lose stubborn body fat as it's an antagonist of alpha receptors, which are the receptors that put a brake on lipolysis and limit fat breakdown. So what yohimbine essentially does is it binds to the alpha receptors and it blocks its activation so that we can actually mobilize fatty acids and burn fat from stubborn body fat areas. So when we use yohimbine hydrochloride, it helps us mobilize free fatty acids from stubborn body fat areas or stubborn fat cells specifically. And it allows us to burn fat from areas that we usually wouldn't be able to burn fat from when the alpha receptors in these areas are activated. Yohimbine also significantly increases catecholamine production, which allows us to get even more free fatty acid release and oxidation when it's combined with fasted exercise. And this is really important. Like when we look at yohimbine, it needs to be used in conjunction with fasted exercise, whether that be cardio, walking, some type of aerobic work. You need to pair the two together because they have a synergistic relationship essentially. So for example, one study found that supplementing with oral yohimbine resulted in a 100% increase in noradrenaline, aka norepinephrine levels, which led to an increase in free fatty acid levels in the blood, which can then be burned off for energy if we engage in exercise and physical activity while taking yohimbine. Another study found that taking yohimbine 30 minutes prior to cardio doubled the free fatty acid levels in the blood. So think about it logically. If you have more free fatty acids available and you do an activity that burns fatty acids, you're going to have a higher predisposition or a higher propensity to burn fat. Now, the caveat with yohimbine is it only works in a low insulin environment. So we need to be fasted when taking it and using it to reap its benefits, which is why if you look at the literature on yohimbine, it's very mixed. And the reason for that is there's a few studies out there that show no fat loss benefit to yohimbine. But the issue with these studies, if you go into the methods sections, you'll see that the way that they had them approach taking yohimbine, it was just a supplement and added in, not at a specific time. So for instance, there's a few studies that have subjects or participants take yohimbine and they had them do it in, combined with like a carb containing meal, or they had them taken in a fed state. So they had already eaten for that day. So what ends up happening is these individuals, if you were to test their insulin levels, you would see that they're elevated because they're in a postprandial state. And so that blunts the actions of yohimbine. So to use yohimbine properly and get the best effect from it, you want to make sure that you take the hydrochloride version first and foremost, and you want to avoid yohimbe, which is a bark extract, which has horrendous side effects, to be honest with you guys. So I definitely advise stay away from that one. But you not only want to get the hydrochloride version, but you want to take it on a fasted stomach 30 to 60 minutes prior to aerobic exercise. So that could be 30 to 60 minutes before fasted cardio, or even just a morning walk. You could utilize whatever method that you so choose or your preference, but this is the way to get the best benefits from it. Now, the next compound that can help with fat loss is ephedrine, which ephedrine honestly is probably one of the most slept on fat burners out there. So I'm going to go into some deep science into ephedrine because honestly, it was unrightfully taken off the market first and foremost, but also it is something that is highly slept on, to say the least. So ephedrine is a central nervous stimulant that it can increase fat loss and improve body composition through a few different mechanisms. First, it increases energy expenditure and metabolic rate. So, for example, one study found that using ephedrine increased resting metabolic rate by 7%, and another study found that combining ephedrine and caffeine led to an 8% increase in 24-hour energy expenditure. Ephedrine is also a really powerful appetite suppressant, so it helps us maintain a deficit by reducing hunger. And if anyone out there has utilized ephedrine, whether that be an old ECA stack, or they utilize something like Bronchide or Primatine, which are other over-the-counter like pharmaceutical versions of ephedrine, you'll notice that it just blunts your appetite. So one study found that caffeine and ephedrine helped to increase weight loss, of which 25% was due to increased metabolic rate, but the other 75% of the weight that they lost was due to its effects on reducing appetite and total calorie intake. Ephedrine is also unique in the fact that its effects actually get better over time. So it doesn't suffer from what a lot of stimulants or central nervous stimulants do, which is not only acclimation, but also downregulation, essentially. So it actually becomes more effective with longer use, according to research. So in one study, they found enhanced thermogenic responsiveness to chronic ephedrine use every day over 12 weeks, where participants continued to lose weight while using the compound over 3 months and still had a thermogenic effect from it. Now, yohimbine, or I keep saying yohimbine, but it's ephedrine, stimulates the beta adrenergic receptors, which helps to increase lipolysis and fat breakdown. Ephedrine also has positive nutrient partitioning effects and has been found to increase fat mass loss and preserve lean mass loss during dieting. So in some of like the research reviews that were done on ephedrine when it was still a over-the-counter supplement that could legally be purchased, they actually postulated, so they had a theory that it actually had anti-catabolic properties. So one study found that when they put a group of individuals on the same weight loss diet, where they were all in the same deficit, so it was calorie equated, and they gave half the group ephedrine plus caffeine, and the other half of placebo, both groups lost the same amount of total weight. So that was just due to the fact that they had the exact same deficit. But the ephedrine plus caffeine group lost 4.5 kilograms more body fat, which is almost 10 pounds more body fat, and they lost 2.8 kilograms, or they lost 2.8 kilograms less fat-free mass, which means they preserve over 6 pounds more of fat-free mass. Now, the next compound that can help with fat loss is growth hormone. And this is because one of growth hormone's main actions is the mobilization of fatty acids from fat cells. So it liberates fatty acids into the bloodstream. And then if we are to follow growth hormone usage, so if you take growth hormone on a fasted stomach, and then you do something that is going to help with increasing energy expenditure and oxidizing those fatty acids, like low intensity aerobic training, like fasted cardio, it's beneficial to increase lipolysis in that manner. So, Jeff, I'll throw this over to you if you want to speak about any of the benefits you've seen from growth hormone. I know this is something that honestly, clinically, you've been using almost your entire life. So you probably are a great example of someone that has benefited from it, first and foremost, for multiple aspects, but just from the fat loss benefits. It isn't a fat loss agent. It's not a thermogenic agent, but it does help with mobilization of fatty acids, which then if you combined, and I've been at your house and I've seen you do this, take a shot, of growth hormone, and then you follow it up with some fasted cardio, and it just helps with the mobilization and burning of fatty acids.
So what I do is I've taken growth hormone since I was roughly 12. So 30 years, a lot more on than off. Long time. I don't have any heart issues. I go get an echo this year. I'm doing all that stuff. Family asked me to do it, but make a long story short, I take it but a lot of the studies talk about you need to be fasted for a few hours after taking it. And when I take GH, you do get a BG bump from it. I usually will take 250 milligrams of metformin, and that will neutralize that from what I've seen. Meaning, if I go into fasted cardio and plug 3 IUs of GH, and I'm normally 85 before I do that, I'll come out of fasted cardio and be in the 70s. So whatever little bump is kind of overcome. I think there's a remarkable difference with those people who use GH with fasted cardio and then don't eat for a little bit, and just kind of let it do its work. I think it's a little bit better with the L-carnitine. I think you could get spicier and add different stuff, but just GH by itself in a fasted state, which you don't hear a lot of. You hear a lot of people say take it before bed, blah 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 blah. And I think it depends upon what you're trying to do. Off season, I'd probably take it before bed. If I'm trying to get peeled out of my head, I'm gonna go shoot it first thing in the morning. I'm gonna go from doing 3 days a week to 5, 6 days a week. So those are my thoughts on it. In the trenches it plays out. I don't think anything more than 4 IUs in a fat loss phase is really, really necessary. And there's a lot of arguments about taking all the GH at once. You could get into fine details on. But for the purpose of this conversation, fasted is superior at about 2 to 3 IUs from what I've seen.
Absolutely. So the next compound that can be used to increase fat loss is a fat burner, and this is clenbuterol. So clen works as a sympathetic nervous system stimulant, which increases both the release of ephedrine and norepinephrine. So what you guys are noticing, when I went through the 3-step process to burn body fat, it all starts with catecholamine. So we need to find ways to increase catecholamine release. And ways to do that is going into a significant calorie deficit because the body is under a stress state. It's going to release those fight or flight hormones, to exercise because that is going to increase fuel mobilization, and then also to utilize certain compounds, including central nervous stimulants. So clen works on the beta receptors, and it helps increase lipolysis and thermogenesis, meaning it increases fatty acid mobilization, it brings more fatty acids into the bloodstream, and then also it increases the amount of calories we burn per day, so it helps to burn off those fatty acids. A 2020 study found that when clen was taken in a fasted state, it increased fat oxidation by 39% and resting energy expenditure by 21%. So, really, when it comes down to fat burning agents that people will use within this community, especially in the enhanced community, this is probably one of the most effective fat burners. Now, there are both pros and cons to utilizing this, so you have to do your own research and really look into it. But it is something that you will find many contest prep competitors and many individuals, fitness models, things of the sort, will utilize during a fat loss phase. And also has, and now this is in rat literature, which I very much do not like going to. However, it does have some anti-catabolic benefits, and there are some, human trials on beta-2 adrenergic and or agonists. So this is the same class of drugs that clen comes from that actually shows anti-catabolic benefits were actually in rehab scenarios and times off from training. It actually helps to preserve lean mass as compared to a placebo group that doesn't take the beta-2 adrenergic and agonist. So they don't take clenbuterol or they don't take albuterol or one of these other classes or one of these other drugs in that class. Now, another supplement I'll just go through, which I didn't initially think about, but you just mentioned it, Jeff, was L-carnitine. So another supplement that may help and may aid in the fat loss process due to its mechanism of action is L-carnitine, because what L-carnitine essentially does is it helps with the transport of fatty acids into the mitochondria for oxidation. So it helps bring fatty acids into the powerhouse of the cell to be burned off as energy. As a result of these actions, L-carnitine has been shown to increase fat oxidation, which spares glycogen levels during exercise. So it actually has some nutrient partitioning abilities where it will actually help you, especially during fasted exercise, where it will help you to burn more body fat or burn more fat for energy, but then it's also preserving your glycogen, which then you can use for resistance training. So a lot of these are nutrient partitioning agents. Now, last but not least, the final supplement that can aid in fat loss is caffeine, which I specifically saved for last, as this is a supplement that I'm confident almost every single listener of the show has used at one point or another. But many of you may not even realize the benefits that caffeine can provide. So caffeine can help with fat loss as it affects both sides of the energy balance equation, meaning it affects both our calorie intake and our calorie expenditure. On the calories out or the calorie expenditure side of the energy balance equation, caffeine use positively impacts multiple components of our total daily energy expenditure. So caffeine raises and increases our resting metabolic rate, meaning it increases the amount of calories we burn at rest, even when we aren't exercising. And research on the weight loss effects of caffeine have found that caffeine use can increase energy expenditure, aka the amount of calories you burn per day, in a dose-dependent manner. So, in one study by Astrup, which is a famous researcher in the realms of thermogenic agents, so he has done a lot of the research on caffeine, done a lot of the research on ephedrine. He found, or his research group found, that caffeine stimulates thermogenesis in a dose-dependent manner in several aspects. So in this study, researchers took healthy individuals who were regular caffeine users, so they were not caffeine naive, and they either had them take a placebo, 100, 200, or 400 milligrams of caffeine. And they then looked at the effects of these differing levels and amounts of caffeine on their energy expenditure and their plasma concentrations of different substrates and hormones. And they found as the caffeine dose increased, participants' energy expenditure increased. They had a higher thermogenic response and had higher levels of plasma triglycerides. So essentially, what this means is that as the dose increased from 100 to 400 milligrams per dose, participants burn more calories and mobilize more free fatty acids into the bloodstream, which could then be burned off as energy. Caffeine also increases our exercise activity thermogenesis, meaning the amount of calories you burn during all forms of exercise, and also can improve performance and energy levels so that we not only burn more during our usual training sessions, whether that's our resistance training sessions or our cardio sessions, but we can also do more total work in the gym, which increases the amount of calories you burn even more. And it's even been shown to increase the thermic effect of feeding or diet-induced thermogenesis. So if you were to combine a cup of coffee with a meal, you will burn more calories with that meal than you would without ingesting caffeine with that meal. Now, on the calories inside of the energy balance equation, caffeine being a central nervous stimulant does stimulate sympathetic drive, which can reduce appetite. Now, generally, these effects are modest, so it's not going to kill your appetite like something like ephedrine would, but it is something that can be used between meals, especially. This is often what I'll do with clients is I'll have them pulse sometimes caffeine early in the day between meals to try to manage hunger during a fat loss phase, and also just to increase energy levels and just kind of keep their mind off things. And another way in which caffeine can help us with fat loss is it actually has positive nutrient partitioning abilities, meaning that it helps cause us to preferentially liberate, mobilize, and burn fatty acids for energy while sparing glycogen, which can then be, when used in conjunction with exercise. So we preferentially burn more fat over carbs for fuel when using caffeine during exercise. So these are the reasons as to why caffeine is the most popular ingredient used in fat burning supplements, as it has so many downstream effects on increasing energy expenditure and fat loss. So that's a wrap on the science of stubborn body fat. And I know this was a topic so many of you have asked me about over the years that I really hope that this deep dive into this topic really helped you to understand more about stubborn fat and also the process required to lose it. Jeff, you have anything else that you want to wrap us up with before we take it on out?
No, man, I want to say one thing. I know we covered the drugs and I'm a big fan of them. I think they work. I think they have their time. I think they have their place. But I think the majority of people get lazy by thinking those things are going to do some of the work and they're not.
And that
Oftentimes,
what is why it was third on the list.
yeah, after, oftentimes I'll dig in on people and the drugs, they're in a good spot. You know in your heart they are, the client knows, and still the answer is I've got to rip more food and kick more activity up. And that just is what it is. So use the everything we talked about is great. Everything we talked about was awesome, and it really should open up your eyes to what different paths, avenues, and the reality of what it takes to do what we talked about today. So B, where can everybody find you at?
Guys, feel free to reach out to me on my email, which is bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. And then for daily content, feel free to follow me at @BrandonDeCruz_. One other thing that I would love for you guys to do, and please do so, follow us on both Spotify and iTunes. That is how a lot of us as podcasters are being really increasing our reach. And really, the intention of the show was to create clarity on complex topics, but we also want to be able to reach more individuals so that you out there who listen, but then also your friends, your family, your peers can feel better, function better, and live a life of abundance. So if you guys could share the show, but also follow it, it'd be much appreciated. Jeff, where can they find you, my man?
Bro, you can find me Jeff Unbreakable Black on IG. By the way, if y'all tag Brandon, tag me. Like I'm kind of on here too. I know B is more beautiful, but you know what? I've got a beard now and a cool scar on my lip. And if you guys want other things I do, I know Brandon's bunch of podcasts. One I only do two. This one, because it's with my boy Brandon. The other one I do with my boy Scoob, and that's ATG Syndicate. I do with him and one of my close friends, Robo. So if you guys looking for me, those are my two spots, and IG is where I hang out. Though I'm getting into TikTok. I do like TikTok. I love it. I love it. A lot of shitty coaches out there on it, but It's right for the taking, man. I swear, because they just take breaks all the time. I'm like, you're just reading. I know you're just reading. You don't even look like you know what you're talking about. But anyway, that's for another day. But I hope you all have a good one. B, it was a pleasure as always chatting, my man.
Absolutely. Later.
Peace.
Peace.